So I'm just going to present a couple of slides first. So we recently got together as an EDI team with all of our key stakeholders, people like Ijeoma, Vice Deans of Equality and Diversity, and we said, what are we actually trying to achieve at UCL? And so this is the statement that we came up with. Our aim is to acknowledge and tackle inequities and power imbalances that affect our communities across the institution. Acknowledging means recognising how we got here and what needs to be done to ensure meaningful equity, inclusion and belonging. And in every EDI presentation, you've got to show data. So unfortunately, I have just picked out a couple of faculties within the School of Life and Medical Sciences. I didn't want to go through all of them, just in the interest of time, so I've just picked out two. But you can see from this data, it's showing the pipeline right from undergraduate, postgraduate talk, postgraduate research, people on research and teaching contracts, such as yourselves, lecturers, associate professors, and professors. So that's along the bottom. Sorry. And then what we can see along the top is we can see this pipeline for non-disabled people and then disabled people underneath. We then look at white and black and minority ethnic, and at the bottom we look at male and female. So you can see that we've got these what we call inverse wedges here, where you can see that at undergraduate level, 67% of students are female, and that drops up to 23% at professorial level. And if you look at black and minority ethnic, we start off in life sciences at 62% at undergraduate level, and then by the time we get up to professorial level, it's 9%. And to look at the Faculty of Brain Sciences, you can see that this inverse wedge is much starker. So undergraduate level, looking at women, we start off, we've got 81% female undergraduate students, and by the time we get to professorial level, it's 34%. So that's very, very compelling data. So these are some of the issues that we're trying to obviously address in EDI. So just before I start, who's heard of Athena Swan? Put your hands up. Okay, good. I don't have to explain it. You're aware it's a gender equality initiative, departments apply, but you have to have an institutional award before you can, before departments can apply. And we've got a silver award, and we're one of the few universities in the country that do. I think there's only about 11. So it's quite a big thing. And last year we had to renew our institutional award, and we failed. And I was leading on those efforts, and it was horrible. And one of the reasons that we failed was data. Now, I could give you lots of reasons why we failed on data, and some of them are very legitimate in terms of challenges around getting HR data, etc. But what I'm going to do instead is own that and say it was horribly embarrassing, because for a university, we've got many scientists in our university, the one thing we should get right is data. So rather than giving sort of reasons around that, what I'm going to do is own that failure, because I actually think failure can be the midwife of leadership as well, and taking accountability around things. But it was horrible, really. And I'm very happy to talk to you, Annie, about some of the other reasons we fail. But what this really enabled me to do is stop and take stock and really examine and reconnect with some very fundamental ways of thinking truths about equality and diversity. And I think things that I'd kind of lost along the way. I've been here 10 years. And when I started at UCL, you know, I did such a huge amount of reading, which I still do, but there were some quite fundamental things that I read and thought when I arrived here that I kind of felt I'd gone a little bit adrift on. So losing the award, not being successful, sorry, was a chance to sort of take stock and reflect personally on where we are. And I want to talk from quite a theoretical point of view, really, but what I want to say is that institutions like UCL are created by us as people, and people are biased. And you'll have heard the term a lot, unconscious bias. I don't like the term unconscious bias, because I've never been quite clear how something that's unconscious can be made conscious. If it's genuinely unconscious, you don't know about it. But I do think something that's implicit can be made explicit. So I always talk about implicit bias, but I also talk about implicit bias. Quite often, we're not talking about implicit bias. We're talking about explicit bias as well. So inevitably, we're human beings, we do have biases, and biases will be built into every aspect of our institutions. And institutions develop their own personalities and their own habits and myths. And what I really want to think about is power, and the way that power is distributed in an institution, and how that has major impact on the institution's tendency to disadvantage individuals from some groups, as Ijeoma very clearly demonstrated, and this data demonstrates as well. So despite all of the best intentions in the world, the dominant group in a institution will be implicitly motivated to maintain the status quo. And I think that's something that I'd forgotten along my journey, actually. We're talking about very deeply entrenched human behaviour, and when you have power, despite your best intentions, you don't want to lose that power, despite what you say and despite what you do. And so looking to the social sciences, social dominance theory suggests that as well as guarding its boundaries against leakages of power, the dominant group within an organisation will actively promote the flow of rewards towards people who are similar to their own members. That's how bias works. And social dominance theory makes it easier to see how an institution might have highly developed and detailed diversity policies and yet fail to make progress on the applications of those policies. So if we understand what power means and to have power and to think that your power is being threatened, you can see how we can have the best policies in the world. We're going to make very little progress in how we apply those. And for the people in the dominant group, diversity can threaten the perceived natural order of things. So I think while overt forms of discrimination may have become unacceptable in this institutional context, there's forms of bureaucratic behaviour that have evolved to achieve the same end. So it's very rare that you encounter very explicit discrimination, but we develop bureaucracies and systems which work to sort of have the same effect, really, of maintaining this status quo. And one very practical example I'll give you that's in my mind at the moment is around student evaluations. So we get students to evaluate teaching, they'll evaluate the programme and the quality of the teaching and the content of that material. And that's, very well intentioned, and we should be doing that to keep up high standards. But there's a huge lot of evidence that shows that students can be biased in how they assess teachers. So students come from all over the world at UCL, they come with their own culture, they come with their own biases. And then we ask them to evaluate teaching. So there's a huge amount of evidence that's showing that students can be biased, particularly against women of colour, because they go into a room and they expect authoritative knowledge to look like a white man. So then they question that, and then that really comes out in the student evaluations, which then would really play into that person's career development. So this is a way in which bureaucratic forms of behaviour achieve the same ends of discrimination, despite being well-intentioned and perhaps unintentional. And breaking these reinforcing practices is immensely hard to do in an institution, and that's what I had to remind myself. So when I talk about going back to basics in my role and thinking about all these things, it was a really simple exercise in reminding myself about not kidding myself, actually, about the scale of the task that we all have in front of us. And I need to stop draining away my energy from doing actual diversity work by being too busy writing reports on how good UCL is at diversity. I need to stop talking about racism and sexism as this sort of unconscious behaviour in a way that lets people off the hook. So we do have implicit biases, but it doesn't get you off the hook. It doesn't mean that we don't all have a responsibility for addressing them and tackling them. And I would say that we want to be agents of change in our institution, and I'm looking to you all here as agents of change as well. I'm not sure what happened in this exercise, but it looks fabulous. Be political, be accountable, be inclusive. So you are all change agents, and I'm not sure what that's about, but I endorse it fully. But if you're going to be change agents in your institution and you're doing your job properly, we will be pointing out that we're not doing as well as we think we are. We have to get over this complacency. And then we have to recognise that if we're pointing out that we're not doing as well as we think we are, we're always going to be the killjoys at the dinner table. We're always going to be that guest that people don't want to invite to their dinner party, because inevitably you're going to have to be pointing out some uncomfortable truths to people, and that's really not difficult, but that's what we have to do as change agents. I want to end on a much more positive note, though, because as Idioma has really well demonstrated, we are doing some fantastic things, and we are actually doing some things that all the evidence shows does work as well. So the good news is that there is a wide body of credible research which tells us the sorts of things that work and which don't work. And I would say what doesn't work, and particularly when we're thinking about biases, what doesn't work is actually policing people's thoughts and actions. And there's a lot of studies that have shown that this kind of force-feeding people can actually activate their biases rather than stamp them out. And I think particularly at UCL, I always say the character of UCL is quite a naughty institution. We're quite rebellious. I mean, we talk about our history, but things, I encounter a lot of sort of, I would say, rebelliousness at UCL. And I think people will often rebel against rules just to assert their own autonomy. People want to be autonomous and not be told what to think. So what I think it's much more effective to do instead is engage people in problem solving. And I'm going to stereotype myself here, but I really like working with the engineering faculty because I have this stereotype that engineers love solving problems. And so whenever I go out to engineering, I never say, this is what we need to do. I say, this is the problem, what should we do? And people get really involved then in sort of helping you think about interventions. So I think co-design is absolutely critical in terms of interventions. And I really absolutely love, being interdisciplinary in approaches as well. So Ijeoma and I are both members of the Commission of Inquiry into Eugenics. And we've got people from all different disciplines on that commission. And we all started out with very deeply held positions on things, and we all had very deeply held positions from different angles. And I think something magical's happened over the course of the year as that we've been meeting and the discussions that we have and how taking such an interdisciplinary approach has been fantastic. Another thing that I think is really effective and what we are doing at UCL is sponsorship. So we don't talk about mentoring. When Ijeoma mentioned the Inclusive Advocates Programme, that's a sponsorship programme. So a mentor would tell you to go to a meeting, a sponsor would take you to that meeting, introduce you to everyone, and make sure you left with a brilliant project that was going to get you promoted. So that's the sorts of things that we're talking about, because it's a way to engage the dominant group and chip away at their biases, because they'll mentor a protégé. They'll get to know that protégé, they'll see that that protégé is completely worthy of merit and opportunity. So I think that's a really, really good approach as well that we know works. And the third thing that I think absolutely works is social accountability around this agenda. We all want to look good in the eyes of our peers. So I think things like obviously being very transparent about data means that we can hold others to account. And it hopefully incentivizes meaningful action as well, as people want to look good and they want to show that they're improving upon this data. So it's very, very hard to tackle biases, but what we can do is use things like social accountability to really sort of drive good behaviour as well. Ijeoma mentioned the Fair Recruitment Specialist initiative that we have. And again, that's more an accountability scheme in that you will have somebody on a panel who can hold you to account for the decisions that you're making. So I think these are really good methods as well. Some good practice that I've just recently encountered in Canada is that faculties will have hiring committees and they have to explain why they haven't shortlisted the top woman of colour on the list and things like that. They'll have to actually explain. So sort of behavioural design and de-biasing our processes as much as possible. So I just want to conclude and say that we did fail the SWAN application. We're resubmitting it in April, which I'm not hugely looking forward to. But failing it never made me think that we should stop doing this. I still stand by it, that this is quite a good change mechanism and it brings people together. But we have to be reminded to keep asking ourselves, what are we doing? What are we doing and how are we doing it? And I think failure can really help remind us who we are and what we really care about as well.